issues to deal with this afternoon. Before I ask you to introduce yourself, I'm just going to ask members of the committee to put on record any particular interest they have that may be relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. I have one property which I rent out.
I'm a councillor in my staff team here.
I have 2 councillors in my constituency office.
I'm a member of Gateshead Metropolitan Borough Council.
I'm Vice President of the LGA.
I'm Vice President of the LGA and also have a small property portfolio.
Okay, right, that's us done with. So over to you, if you just say who you are and the organisation you're representing.
I'm Dan Wilson-Crawd, Director of Generation Rent.
I'm Netta Isaacson, Policy Researcher at Citizens Advice.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to be with us this afternoon. To begin with, just asking about the quality of accommodation in the private rented sector. Now, very often you mention the private rented sector and everyone thinks, oh, you know, of the worst properties they can possibly imagine. But when you actually ask tenants and surveys, over 80% of them say they're basically satisfied with their properties. What does that tell you about the state and quality of properties in the private rented sector? Do you think it's actually getting better?
I think the 80% sort of correlates quite well with what we see in the problems with housing. So 18% is what the English Housing Survey finds as the number of as the proportion of private rented properties that have Category 1 hazards, so the most severe hazards. So we might expect that a big chunk of those 20% or thereabouts of private renters who say they're dissatisfied are living in unsafe homes. There may be others who have other problems with their property.
I would say that sometimes the satisfaction criteria can be a bit of a misnomer. I think particularly in the private rented sector, renters tend to have very low expectations of their housing, and if their landlord is even meeting legal responsibilities, they're pretty pleased with what they're getting. So I think it can be a bit misrepresentative to be content with 80% saying they're satisfied. We certainly at Citizens Advice see more private renters than we do those from other tenures, and repairs and maintenance is up there. It's consistently the most frequently brought up issue by private renters, so it's certainly a concern we would see more broadly across the piece.
Okay. Is it getting better?
We don't really see it is getting better. The proportion of homes that are considered unsafe has gone down, but that's in line with the sector actually expanding. So we've still got a significant number, around 800,000 properties which are unsafe, and that's sort of fluctuated over the years. And I think a lot of the new properties probably are coming into the sector are better quality, but there's still we don't see enough evidence of properties actually getting better because of various problems with enforcement of the law and tenants having the ability to get repairs done in their home.
Yeah, as you say, whilst the proportion has gone down, the actual number has, I think, slightly increased actually over the past decade, and the numbers coming to us haven't significantly dropped by any means for repairs and maintenance issues. So using that as a marker, we don't think there's been that much of a significant improvement, at least.
Right. So looking at the properties where there isn't satisfaction and where there are risks in the property where there are poor standards, are there particular groups of tenants who are more likely to be living in that sort of accommodation where, for want of a better word, they are being exploited potentially by the landlords who own them?
I think what we tend to find is that basically anyone who's a private renter can can find themselves in a poor property, particularly if they're struggling to pay the rent and they find themselves moving into somewhere where they're trying to pay as little rent as possible. So they might they might take a poorer quality home because they can manage the rent more easily than if they were paying an extra £100 a month for something slightly better quality. So so in London that could be young professionals, but probably the most likely, the highest risk type of tenant is someone who is claiming housing benefit, because that shrinks the number of the pool of properties that they can actually access. It's likely that landlords who are, well, certainly not all landlords, but many landlords who will accept housing benefit might also be willing to cut corners in terms of how the quality of their properties. Certainly, we would say that there's tenants claiming housing benefit would have the most risk of being in an unsafe home.
Yeah, I'd certainly echo that, as the LHA rate has reduced the number of properties available for that group. That is just a distinct difficulty that they face. In some research we did which looked at the HHSRS and some of the most common categories that come up for renters within that, we actually found that families, households with children in them were consistently more likely to report that they'd had those HHSRS problems during their current tenancy. So there's potentially that group there that we see experiencing more problems too.
Right. Is that due to the way the landlords behave, or because of the particular nature of the household in terms of families with children?
I don't think you could separate the two necessarily from the piece of research that we did, and there certainly are a proportion of that group that experienced problems whose landlords responded in a very timely fashion to their problems, because we asked about that responsiveness too. But it was in about a fifth of cases where their landlords either hadn't ever fixed the problem or it had taken an excessive amount of time for them to do so. So I think that kind of both things are at play.
And just going back to the tenants on housing benefit, are there particular landlords who will almost make a living out of letting to people in those circumstances, knowing they have nowhere else to go, and they can let pretty bad properties to them?
That tends to be the what we find. It will be there will be a lot of landlords who are maybe they got into letting out property without meaning to. Maybe they inherited a property and aren't particularly aware of their responsibilities and obligations, and you may find that their homes are unsafe, but or that they're unresponsive to their tenants. But what we found is that most unsafe homes are the result of a landlord taking a particular strategy with how they let out the property, and knowing that they can intimidate their tenants into not reporting problems, or knowing that they can get other as desperate tenants in if the tenant leaves. This is part of their business model.
Okay, thanks. Well, moving on to the complaints issue. Helen.
What are the main obstacles to tenants in pursuing complaints against their landlords?
So we did some research that looked at that question based on a landlord's Section 11 responsibilities to keep a house in repair based on structure and exterior and so on. And that found that the main reason that tenants whose landlord had failed to carry out their legal responsibilities in that manner was fear of eviction, and that came out really strongly as the main reason, closely followed by fear that their landlord would increase the rent. So in both cases, fear of retaliation for pursuing that complaint. That meant that tenants would, for instance, fix the disrepair themselves or just keep quiet or move to a new property rather than pestering their landlord to fix it or pursuing more formal means. We also looked specifically at the court route, where a tenant could take a disrepair claim. And in that case, there were two main things that came out that prevented tenants from pursuing those complaints, and that was the cost involved, which is very difficult for tenants to predict. So it's not necessarily just the sum total that it may cost them at the end, it's the unpredictability of that. And then also the complexity of that court process, which it is very, very complicated even to understand whether your disrepair claim has any chance of success. And that also involves costs. So to even understand whether you may have a chance of success, you often have to pay a lawyer to look through previous cases and so on. And that in and of itself puts off a lot of tenants from pursuing those more formal routes.
We've heard similarly that it's the fear of eviction or the fear of a rent rise that puts a lot of tenants off making the complaint in the first place, or raising it to the council if the landlord's unresponsive. And then even if they do contact the council, they now most tenants have the rights now. Might expect protection from a retaliatory eviction if the council serves an improvement notice. But we found that the experience of some tenants is that the council hasn't been able to issue an enforcement notice, or just for whatever reason hasn't done what the tenant was expecting.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of a lack of confidence in that protection from the council.
I think there's a couple of things at play with the current retaliatory eviction provisions. Firstly, the bar for that protection is set incredibly high because it is category 1 and 2 hazards. So that in and of itself is a very complicated HHSRS system as it is. So as a tenant, you have to get your head around that and understand whether the disrepair you're seeing in your home, say the damp and mould that you're seeing all around you, is going to meet that threshold or not. And then secondly, we know that a lot of local authorities aren't having a lot of inspections, they aren't carrying out a lot of enforcement action. So as a tenant, it's very difficult to rely on that retaliatory eviction provision, and it's a very risky route to go down if you suspect that your landlord might issue you with a no-fault eviction notice.
In your experience, how aware are tenants of their rights and of the processes for escalating complaints against a landlord who isn't meeting their responsibilities?
We find quite often that the reason that a tenant comes to citizens' advice is because they're trying to understand what their options are. They say, I'm in this situation, I have this problem in my home, my landlord isn't responding or has said they're not going to do anything about it, what can I do? And then obviously we set out the various options, but have to remind people that there are risks, for instance, with retaliatory eviction. And there are a lot of cases where tenants will say that they're not willing to take that risk, which is fairly understandable.
We don't have figures, but anecdotally we have tenants who approach us often when it's sort of they're quite the way down the line, they've actually been served with an eviction notice, and they hadn't considered contacting the council previously, or they weren't fully aware of what the council could do, or what sort of situation the council would help. So there was an awareness that there might be protection, but given that there are 29 different types of hazards in the HHSRS, there's not a lot of awareness among certainly some of the tenants that we've spoken to of just what they can expect.
What new powers could be given to tenants to redress the power relationship between landlords and tenants and reduce the risk of retaliatory evictions?
We were very supportive of the private members' bill, which was debated on Friday, the Fitness for Human Habitation bill, which would give tenants a route through courts to take action if they didn't want to take the council's support, or if the council weren't able to support them fully. What we found, though, given the experience of the retaliatory eviction protections, is that they're not sufficient, and you know, even if a tenant were to take their landlord to court, the landlord, you know, would be free to issue a Section 21, assuming, you know, various other conditions were in place, or they could raise the rent. And so we think that any, you know, as part of how the government's obviously looking at bringing in longer tenancies or greater security of tenure, and we think that as a minimum, this sort of protection from rent rises and from no fault evictions would have to be a central part of that in order to give tenants that confidence to seek redress from their landlord.
Yes, I think the first thing to point out is that there has been some positive progress in this area, partly through the Fitness for Human Habitation. One of the main benefits of that, I think, will be that it sets a really clear, really simple standard that hopefully tenants will understand a bit more in terms of their rights. And even for those that don't feel able to go to court, it will give them a bit more bargaining power in terms of that informal negotiation with their landlord about their rights. Similarly, we're pleased that the government is planning to introduce a mandatory ombudsman for landlords. Again, having that non-court-based route can be a really positive thing for a lot of tenants, and it's very rare to find a consumer market where you don't have a non-court-based route to resolve these sorts of disputes. Both of those schemes are reliant on a tenant feeling able to access them, feeling able to use them. And as Dan said, unless there's that security in place, that's going to be really difficult. Those issues of quality and security are intrinsically linked, and you have to, if you're aiming to improve quality in the private rented sector, there has to be a conversation about securing tenancies. And that comes as two parts, really. There's the security overall, so in the form of those family-friendly tenancies that government is hoping to introduce in the build-to-rent sector, we would really want to see that across the board, so all private renters have that security, and then additional security where a dispute is currently underway. So that would be enhancing the retaliatory eviction provisions that currently exist. So whether you're applying to a local authority, whether you've applied to the redress scheme, you know that you can't be evicted because you sent in that application.
Could you say a little bit about the role that the Section 21 provisions play in all of this, and what those provisions mean for many tenants in the private rented sector in their experience?
So the Section 21, or the no-fault eviction, is an eviction that a tenant has no defence against, assuming that the landlord has carried out the eviction notices properly and so on. And how that interacts with the retaliatory eviction provisions as they currently stand means that if you as a tenant were to complain to your landlord and go through the local authority enforcement notice process, you can end up in a sort of race against your landlord if they choose to issue you with a Section 21 notice, where you're hoping that your local authority will inspect and choose to issue an enforcement notice before your Section 21 possession hearing. And if that doesn't take place, you have no defence against that eviction, even if there is legitimate Category 1 or 2 hazards in your home.
Do you want to add anything? Did you want to add anything?
I would add, on Section 21, there are certain conditions so that a landlord can't issue one if they haven't protected the deposit, and if they haven't furnished the tenant with a certain documents at the start of the tenancy which set out their rights.
It's been, since the 1st of October 2014, it's been a legal requirement for all letting agents in England to belong to one of 3 government-approved redress schemes. In your experience, how effective is that measure in the law?
We're collecting data at the moment to see just what impact this has had and if tenants are using the process. Our instinct is that we haven't. The redress schemes don't have a huge amount of their remit is quite narrow in terms of if you've been ripped off by your letting agent, if they've included an unfair term in their contract, or if they've reneged on an agreement in setting up a tenancy, then those are sorts of issues that would be addressed, but there are a much wider range of issues that the renter might find themselves up against. So it's because of, I think because of that, it's not huge, there's not a great amount of awareness of the process. But on the whole, we did do some research while we were looking at the letting fees, and found that there's a minority, probably 1 in 10 agents we found didn't have their redress scheme listed on their website, which may have meant that they weren't compliant, or maybe they were compliant, but we're just missing out this one badge.
Yeah, I would echo the comments on the scope of the schemes, and that also makes it more difficult from a consumer perspective if certain things fall in scope and others don't. And we've done quite a lot of work on alternative dispute resolution and redress schemes across the consumer landscape, and it's a common complaint is redress schemes that only deal with targeted issues, which means that you can apply, get rejected because your issue is slightly out of scope, and you end up being ping-ponged between various schemes. So that's definitely something that could be improved. I think there's a couple of other issues with the redress schemes as they currently are. The first one is around security. It's still an issue with your agent as a tenant. If you don't feel like you can complain, then you're not going to access the scheme. So again, that issue comes up. And secondly, it is quite a complicated redress landscape in housing, and that does confuse many tenants, both in terms of what you can apply for and where you can apply. So that's something that we hope that the introduction of mandatory redress for landlords can actually be an opportunity to simplify redress across the housing landscape. So whether it is an issue with your deposit or disrepair or an agent delivering poor service, that it's really clear and there's a single entry point as a tenant from which your complaint can be dealt with.
Mark and then Andrew.
Mr. Wilson-Court, can I just ask about the evidence on retaliatory eviction? You've talked about the risk. What estimate have you made about that level of risk?
The risk that the local authority doesn't...
No, the risk that someone will be retaliatory evicted.
So we've done some research looking at who's experienced an eviction or an unwanted move, and about one in 4 private renters have experienced an unwanted move. The English Housing Survey had... if the private renter has been given a no-fault eviction under Section 21, if they have had an unreasonable or unaffordable rent increase, or if they've been harassed by the landlord into...
So that's a bit wider than a retaliatory?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the risk level for retaliatory?
The English Housing Survey looked at this as well, so they published some data last summer which found that it was about 1 in 6 of every move within the private renter sector was a similar sort of unwanted move. Within that, it's very difficult. So I think it was a smaller number in a single-digit percentage, which was the landlord issuing an eviction notice. But whether that was a retaliatory eviction or not, we don't have the data for that. The other thing we do know is that 63% of evictions were a result of the landlord wanting to either move back in or sell the property, and that's from the English Housing Survey as well.
That, I would imagine, is separate from retaliatory
Indeed,
eviction
yes.
in the description. So is there a percentage that you have?
We don't, but I believe that Shelter did some research on this, which I don't have to hand.
It's a very difficult thing to actually do research on, because often as a tenant you won't know that is the reason you've been evicted. You may suspect, but that's not the same thing. We've done a bit of research looking at consumer perceptions around that, and it was 14% of tenants that felt they had been penalised as a result of raising a complaint. 14%. But then the kind of other side of the coin is tenants that fear raising complaints in the first instance, and that's significantly higher. It's approximately half of tenants that say they've not raised a complaint because they feared that they'd be evicted if they did. And that obviously has negative consequences for landlords, for the housing stock as a whole. So the problem of retaliatory eviction isn't purely one for tenants, it is one for the wider housing market.
Though, as you were saying to Ms Hayes, that the challenge around that is as much about informing consumers, presumably, because you expressed concern earlier that consumers weren't clear about what their rights actually were.
There's definitely an element of consumer education, in part simplifying laws so that as a tenant it's reasonable to expect you to understand what your rights are, because it is very complicated, a lot of housing law. But at the same time, I don't think we can say that it is purely an issue of consumer education. Retaliatory eviction is a real issue that tenants experience. So fear of eviction is quite a legitimate concern for many people, particularly when there are a lot of costs to moving, as well as the personal upheaval to yourself and your family.
Yes. No, I was just trying to get what the evidence was. Thank you.
Okay. Liz.
Okay, I'd like to ask about enforcement, please. And Shelter told us that tenants are subject to a postcode lottery with regard to the level of support they receive from local authorities in dealing with dangerous hazards in the home. So, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think we'd support Shelter in saying that there is a postcode lottery, in the sense that there's a large element of variability depending on which borough you happen to be in. Some boroughs, Newham's always cited as the one that carries out the majority of enforcement within London, and I think about half nationally. As soon as you have certain boroughs that are taking that much action, whilst others are barely issuing any enforcement notices and a very low number of inspections, that means that your experience as a tenant is going to be a bit of a lottery.
It's not looking at the differences between councils, but we found an average which goes back to a report published by Karen Buck in 2015, which found that the average local authority receives 433 complaints, and of those it inspects only 260. And so we would hope that, I mean, it suggests that there's a big councils are generally underperforming in terms of their responsiveness. And then of those 260 inspections on average, we're getting 70 category 1 hazards which are being identified. So, you might find that some of the inspections are prompted by a lack of, less severe hazards. But then of those, only 17 enforcement notices were issued. So 17 out of 70 suggests that there's this shortfall in local authorities actually following up. These figures actually date back to 2013-14, which was before the retaliatory eviction protections came in. So we would like to see those numbers increase, but it shows that there's this sort of lack of responsiveness from local authorities in general to severe hazards.
Right. So the first hurdle is people knowing what they can ask of the local authority. If I got you right last time, the information about what they can talk to the local authority about.
I think that is a hurdle, and obviously knowing your rights is the first step to enforcing them. However, I don't think it's the most significant hurdle. Right. I think the lack of enforcement is much more of a hurdle than consumers knowing where to turn.
So, in your experience, do local authorities require more powers or more resources, or both?
I think the variability points to the fact that not all of the existing powers are being used in equal measure across the country. So I'm sceptical whether introducing new powers as such would necessarily improve enforcement or equalise enforcement nationally, for instance. Funding is certainly a problem many local authorities face. It's worth remembering that it's not only the fact that local authorities have seen substantial cuts, it's also that that's come at a time where the private rented sector has doubled in size. So we're trying to deal with more with less.
They have new powers that came in April, and then some new ones that are coming in later this year on banning orders. And so we may find that many councils actually use those powers very effectively, and we've spoken to some councils who are for whom this is will has the potential to transform their performance in enforcement. And I think another, but in addition to resources, so these new powers will give them access to greater resources through fines, civil penalties to landlords. I think that there is a need to, there's a danger that a lot of tenants who've experienced poor practice in the past and haven't had the support they should expect from councils are now kind of they've got a bad a poor image of the council and won't expect to be supported again in the future, even though there may be grounds for them to actually ask for some ask for an inspection and enforcement from the council in future.
Okay, so you think, if I'm getting this right, that although there are new powers that will come on board, people may not use them. They may be sceptical of them.
That's the danger. I think we need to have there needs to be effective communication to tenants of their rights, especially because one of the new changes is a rent repayment order, where if a landlord hasn't responded to an enforcement notice, that the tenant can claim back rent, which I think ought to be quite a powerful option for tenants. And it may well be the local authority who could lead that awareness raising, or central government.
Thanks. Going on to the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation and Liability for Housing Standards Bill, which we touched on already. How would this bill, which recently received government support, help tenants to seek redress for inadequate private rented accommodation?
So I'll try not to repeat what I said earlier. I think it's an important legal right for tenants to have, and so we're very pleased that it's being introduced. In terms of the practicalities of it, it sets a really clear standard, irrelevant of what tenure you're in. It widens the range of health and safety hazards that you can take a landlord to court over if they're not keeping in repair or they're not fixing. So that's really important. It also potentially offers a bit more negotiation for a tenant. We know that a lot of tenants aren't able to go through a court process or aren't willing to do so, but hopefully the bill will still increase their rights and tenants' awareness of their rights.
In addition to what I mentioned earlier about improving security, that there would be, I think one of the important things to get right is giving tenants the access to legal support that they would need for to bring an action against a landlord.
So does the bill fully address the concerns that have been expressed about the quality of accommodation, or is there more that the government could and should do?
Certainly on the security question, the government should be doing more, and I think in terms of legal access, it's important to have a look at what legal aid is available for tenants who might qualify for that in order to use this new right.
Yeah, by its nature, it deals with the very worst housing and the very worst condition. And it does so very effectively, but there's a need to accompany that with a wider set of non-court-based opportunities where perhaps the disrepair isn't meeting the uninhabitable status, but is still a landlord failing to meet their legal responsibilities to a tenant.
Thank you.
Yes, turning to the licensing schemes that are in operation, we've heard conflicting evidence on this particular issue. And so I think we'd be grateful to hear from you what evidence there is that licensing schemes actually produced an improvement in the quality of housing provided. If any, I mean, you may not have any evidence, but
obviously the best case study we have of licensing so far is Newham, and it's recently had its scheme renewed by the government, and so it's seen an increase in its enforcement notices against landlords who have fallen foul of the licensing scheme through whether it's licensing or conditions not meeting their responsibilities, essentially. So on the basis that it's driven landlords out of the market, it's seen landlords prosecuted, and it's seen other forms of enforcement which may have ended up with the landlord becoming compliant, then it has been very effective. And
could I just push you on that bit? Because clearly the committee's meet is going to Newham, and we've had a lot of contact with Newham. But one of the concerns will be that has it actually improved the quality of housing, or has it just driven that housing out of the market, and therefore there's less housing available without the landlords actually implementing what we want to see, which is decent quality housing?
I don't have the figures for that, but if a landlord leaves the sector and sells a property, then that property will become a home to someone else, whether that's an owner-occupier or another landlord, a tenant who rents from another landlord. And so we don't think there is really a risk of those homes, the supply of homes reducing because of this. That's
clearly in answer to earlier questions. One of the issues is that if a landlord invests in the property, they're going to expect to recover the money. That can be passed on in the additional rent. So, have you got any evidence of that happening? That the licensing is then forcing landlords to do what they should do, which is provide decent quality housing, but that then leads to increased rents that people who are finding it difficult to manage their finances then can't afford to pay.
We don't have evidence on that.
So,
Yeah, it's not something that Citizens Advice have done extensive research into.
right, okay. So at the moment, we don't have that evidence. Clearly, Newham is an example of where this has been used quite extensively, but there are other areas where smaller lots have been paid. Is there any evidence from those smaller areas? Because they tend to be more focused areas rather than the borough-wide arrangements that Newham have made.
One observation we have on other schemes is that sometimes if there's if they're focused on a particular area where there's concerns about exploitation of tenants or poor quality in general, there's the enforcement resources of the council will be focused on that entirely, or there's a concern that would be the case, and someone in a different part of the council area who had a concern about a landlord and raised it with the council, we would be concerned if there wasn't a response to that. There's clearly, councils will want to remove, particularly egregious criminal behaviour from the area, but at the same time, we have, tenants are reliant on councils to enforce their rights.
I mean, I think the point we're making here is we want to see measures that improve the quality of housing, and if you've got evidence that the licensing schemes are working, then that might be a means towards greater use of that schemes. But if there isn't any evidence yet, then we need to see that happening before I think it will be rolled out nationally. But fine. Okay, thank you.
Right, moving on to the draft tenant fees bill. Mark.
Can I just look at the bill from the point of view of the tenants, what the impact is, and get your views on this? We've had conflicting written evidence around this area, but obviously the central question that many people ask is, do you think that rents will increase if the fees in question are banned? And how do you see that rolling out in terms of the impact for tenants?
Assuming that the legislation effectively bans fees, so there aren't loopholes written into the wording of the legislation, we'd anticipate that tenants will save hundreds of pounds every time they move. The average fee by our research that a tenant pays is £400 to their letting agent. And we would anticipate that if you banned letting agent fees, that you would be making the market work more fairly, and you'd fix that dysfunctional feature with the tripartite relationship between a renter, a landlord and a letting agent, and you'd limit competition to the functioning side of that market, so namely between the landlord and letting agent. Because landlords are able to shop around for their agent, they're able to move if they're paying too high a price or they're receiving poor service, we'd expect letting agents to have to compete more actively for that work. Whereas at the moment, tenants are forced to use whichever agent happens to have the property that they wish to be their home. So we'd anticipate the letting agents will be absorbing the vast majority of the cost of this policy as a result of that increased competition.
So you don't think rents will go up?
No, we haven't seen evidence from Scotland. I think that your own committee found that there was inconclusive evidence of that. So we don't have any evidence that would be the case, and judged on the fact that there are inflated fees at the moment and there is double charging of landlords and tenants, we'd at least anticipate that tenants will definitely save money and that letting agents will absorb at least the vast majority of the cost of it.
I mean, some people have argued that slightly higher rents for over a period instead of an upfront fee would be preferable. What's your view about it?
Yes, that's what our evidence shows, that there's people significantly prefer a shared burden over a period of time rather than upfront lump sum, and that's particularly true for tenants who are on the lowest incomes, who find it particularly difficult to get together those hundreds of pounds potentially every 6 months.
We agree that because of the extra competition, the extra impetus for landlords to shop around, letting agents will reduce their fees to the landlords, and then what they charge tenants won't be passed on in full to the landlord. And then our view is that because tenants are able to, without having to pay £400 every time they move, I mean, there are other costs, of course, but it makes the barriers to moving lower. Tenants will have extra clout in the market as well, so they can, if a landlord tries to raise the rent, the tenant will find it easier to move to a cheaper home. And similarly, if the tenant, if there is a problem with the home, then if something needs fixing, then the landlord can't ignore it as easily because because of this knowledge that the tenant could move out more easily. So because of the other thing to bear in mind is that only a third of landlords have, 2/3 of landlords don't have a mortgage, or 2/3 of private rented properties aren't mortgaged. So there's a big part of the market where the landlord's able to absorb any extra costs quite easily. So we don't see that as resulting in higher rents. If a landlord did try and raise the rent, then they might find that the rest of the market isn't responding in the same way. But that said, if that a lot of tenants will prefer to avoid costs at the start of the tenancy if it means that, even if it means that they're paying slightly more. Yeah.
So why do you think the government's put specifically into the bill measures to try and limit rent increases, if, as you say, they aren't going to happen?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Why you're saying that you don't anticipate rents will rise? So why has the government then chosen to put into the bill measures that are looking to actually limit those rent increases?
Because landlords and or letting agents, if they're inclined in a certain way, will try and find any excuse to add the costs to the tenants, pass the costs on to the tenant. Yeah, so I think, I mean, I think it's sensible of the government to include this clause to prevent the fees being kind of front loaded onto the rent, because there will be less scrupulous agents who will try and do that if there weren't restrictions on doing that.
And some people have argued that one of the natural results of this will be people, if they aren't going to be able to, agents aren't going to charge fees, then landlords will actually be taking on more of the responsibilities themselves and letting direct. Is that to be welcomed, or is that what are the risks from that? Start with Mr. Wilson-Crawl.
The English Housing Survey looked at satisfaction rates for tenants who had paid a fee at the start of the tenancy and tenants who hadn't. And tenants who hadn't paid a fee, so we might assume they aren't renting through a letting agent, were more satisfied with their tenancy by about 8 percentage points. So that's, I'm not sure if that's something we can apply to the post fee world, but it suggests that there isn't a huge difference in quality between self-managed properties and agent-managed properties. If anything, landlords who manage properties directly do a better job.
Right. Okay, so you're happy to have the agents out of it altogether?
I'm sorry?
So you're happy to have the agents out of it altogether?
Well, clearly there's a role for agents where a landlord isn't living in nearby, but I would imagine that it would be quite difficult for a landlord to decide to take it on as a self-managed property, and if they do, then it's doubly important that we have effective forms of redress for the tenant in that situation. Okay.
And what's the citizens' advice?
Yeah, there's no particular evidence that a letting agent versus a self-managing landlord would be better than the other. There's a large variability in the quality of letting agents, and hopefully some additional regulation, as the government's planning, will bring up those standards. Because a lot of landlords are accidental, naive landlords that have come into the business not necessarily thinking of themselves as a business, rather it's a secondary source of income. So there's definitely a real need for quality letting agents in the private rented sector. But as it currently stands, there's variability that means you can't really say that letting agents in and of themselves are better than self-managing landlords.
I mean, for you, the critical thing here is the question as to who the client is, and therefore who is paying for what service. So therefore the desire to look to remove fees charged up front to tenants is because you regard the agent obviously as being an agent of the landlord, and therefore it is the landlord that should be paying for charges or services undertaken. Is that the essence?
Yes. The landlord is paying for a service from the letting agent in order to get their income from the rent. So that's where the service should be provided and the payment should be made.
One of the slightly more technical things, and I perhaps should declare an interest as I put the legislation in the first place, around regulatory impact assessments, is that this bill doesn't actually have a full impact assessment at the moment. Now, civil servants have told us this is because it's a draft bill, which wouldn't have happened when I was the Deregulation Minister. But nevertheless, we don't have a proper impact assessment at the moment, so we can't make an accurate assessment of the costs. Are you concerned that at this point we don't have any published impact assessment as to the actual net costs of the change in legislation?
I think with any large or meaningful piece of legislation, it would be sensible to carry out an impact assessment, both in terms of the financial and the non-financial costs and impacts of it being carried out. So we hope to see the government carry one out.
I agree. We're not particularly concerned at this stage. I think the sooner we see it, the better.
I mean, presumably the critical issue here is what is the cost to the various parties involved, both to government, but more importantly, obviously, to agents, landlords, and indeed potentially to tenants. So you would like to see that published ASAP?
It would certainly, it would help with the determining what should be in the bill eventually.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Mr. Prisk answered a little bit of his question, which relates to what I want to ask you, and it's if the draft bill is clear and workable. So do you think there are any loopholes or unintended consequences of the draft bill?
I think Meta will fill in the gaps, but one thing that we noticed was around the front loading of fees onto rent. There seems to be this is in Schedule 1, Section 1.6, which is differential rents. There's a clause in there that says that the landlord and the tenant can agree terms where a differential rent is paid. We're a little bit concerned by that because we are quite concerned by it, very concerned by it, because it means that if a tenant if the tenant feels like they can't negotiate with the landlord, then they're desperate for the property. Then they will take whatever terms they're presented by the landlord just to get a roof over their head. And so I think we should try and avoid inserting clauses like that, which open up this possibility of unfair terms. And generally, we're opposed to including a default fee in there for similar reasons, where the letting agent or landlord could write in certain requirements that, if broken.
So you'd want the default fee removing, and I mean, obviously there's the question then, isn't there, for landlords, if something goes wrong or if something is broken, or from a how would landlords then be able to safeguard their property? So I don't want to make it one against the other, but obviously that's the flip side of that, isn't there?
That we recognise that there are those situations, and which is why we have the security deposit that the tenant pays, and so we would expect that anything that the landlord wants to claim back should go through, should be claimed at the end of the tenancy, and go through the tenancy deposit protection scheme process, so that the tenant has an opportunity to say, actually, no, this was this wasn't my fault, or whatever it was, to mitigate it.
Okay. Yeah, there are, just to follow on from that point, there are of course a number of costs that might arise during the course of a tenancy that a tenant is liable for, but there are already existing mechanisms that landlords can recoup those costs by. There is the deposit that the vast majority of landlords take, but additionally you can take a damages claim in the same way that a tenant would if the landlord breached the contract. So that already exists. So we don't see any reason for this clause to be in the legislation, and we think it has the potential to really fundamentally undermine the tenant fee bill, and it introduces a massive loophole. By its nature, the default fee clause means that if a tenant breaches a condition within their tenancy, they can be liable for a cost, and there's no set tenancy agreements in England, which means that landlords and agents who so chose could introduce any condition really that they like and attach a fee to it as a result. We've our housing lawyers at Citizens Advice have gone and looked at existing tenancy agreements to see where there might be clauses that already exist that would be exempt from the legislation as a result of the fee clause. And there's a number of fees that already are legitimate and would be after the ban. These are things like not removing your rubbish on a weekly basis, or not informing your landlord that you've updated your contact details. Quite things like this that would definitely, we think, within the current default fee clause, fall as an exemption. Our broader concern, however, is how letting agents or landlords could abuse this clause going forward once the legislation has been passed. By its nature, if you can add a condition and attach a fee to it, that leaves the door open to a wide range of fees. We think it would be possible, for instance, for inventory fees to be charged within it. We think renewal fees and exit fees will be particularly difficult to make sure they aren't charged as a result of this. As such, the default fee clause has the potential to essentially make the lettings market less transparent and just shift fees from an upfront cost to something that's embedded deep in your tenancy contract. So we're hugely concerned about the impact of it, its ability to mean that tenants are charged fees even following the passing of this legislation. In essence, it will undermine the purposes that the government is trying to achieve.
Just clarify with both of you then, so would you rather that be taken out, or would you have it or basically just firmed up in what they can actually claim as a default deposit, or scrap it altogether?
Yeah, we would strongly suggest scrapping it altogether, because landlords have existing mechanisms that they can recoup the costs that come up through the course of a tenancy. So there is no positive benefit from having the clause in there. All it does is muddy the waters in terms of what a legitimate fee is. It will confuse tenants. It will mean that rogue agents and landlords find ways to creatively use this clause to charge a wide range of obscure fees, thus undermining the legitimate landlords and agents who try and abide by the spirit of the law.
Would agree with that?
You spoke earlier as well with Mr. Piss with regards to fees being charged through the back door. Well, basically, what do you think should be done to reduce this risk, if anything?
So I suppose we would need to make sure that the prohibited fees list and the permitted fees list is as clear as possible, and ideally without any default fees whatsoever. If a letting agent then charged a fee to a tenant, and therefore they'd be in breach of the law, then there's obviously within the bill proposals for enforcing the law. One thing that we would like to see, in addition to that, is the tenant, an entitlement for the tenant to claim back more than just what fees they've paid, because currently with a security deposit that isn't protected, they can claim compensation, or they can be awarded compensation of up to 3 times the value of the deposit. And we could apply the same principle to fees, so that if a letting agent charges someone a fee, they could be taken to court, and the penalty for the letting agent would be much more than what they would be collecting in fees. So and that could be in addition to the powers that the local authorities will have.
Okay. Yeah, so as well as scrapping the default fee clause, the initial definition, which talks about the grant, renewal and continuance of a tenancy, we'd want it to explicitly include exit fees within that, so we're not just seeing a shift of fees to the conclusion of tenancies. There are lots of ways that this legislation could be enforced more actively than the current legislation sets out, and the reliance on trading standards and county court is likely to be quite ineffective, particularly because of the reasons Dan pointed out. We know that tenants are very unlikely to go to court, particularly when there's a discretionary award that they could receive. And we'd like to see that be mandatory, and we'd like to see a penalty on top of that as an optional. There are ways you could use the redress schemes, for instance, to enable tenants to retrieve costs that way. But ultimately, we can talk about all these different ways to enforce. There are lots of different ways that you could add on that would improve the bill, but ultimately, whilst the default fee clause is inscribed into the legislation, enforcement is going to be fairly futile, because there will be lots of creative ways of avoiding the meaning of the legislation, and it will be very difficult for tenants to know if they even have a right to challenge it, let alone go through that process and to do so. It's worth pointing out that what happened in Scotland when in the 80s they tried to ban letting agent fees, but there was some poor wording in there that meant nearly 3 decades later they were back. They were amending that legislation and making it watertight. We have the opportunity to make this right first time, otherwise we'll be here in 3 decades' time having the same conversation.
I think you both said that holding deposits require clarification, and I think you spoke about that in your answer. Thank you.
On holding deposit, I would add that we think that there's a risk that letting agents, and we hear this from renters currently, that letting agents take several holding deposits from different tenants at any one time, and then whichever tenant gets the property at the end of it, they'll pay the rent and the deposit and everything else, and the other tenants will get their holding deposits returned to them in most cases. In some cases they don't even get that, and I think there's an opportunity to prevent that sort of practice from happening, because tenants don't have, when you're looking for a home, you don't have a week or more. 15 days, I think, is specified in the bill, to wait to find out if you've got a tenancy or not. And if the government is going to be regulating letting agents and landlords through proposals that have been announced by the Secretary of State last October, then there's an opportunity there to have for the letting agent to say, okay, this property has this holding deposit on it, it's taken off the market. This tenant, they can provide evidence to the tenant who has put down the holding deposit that no one else has an interest in that. It's theirs, and it's just up to the landlord to say yes or no. Because otherwise we might have this situation where letting agents are doing this practice even more for whatever reason, and so we think this is an opportunity to specify within the bill that this practice shouldn't be carried out.
Finally, you talked about the fact that where landlords have got costs they should probably be trying to recover, they can use the deposit that they take at the beginning of the tenancy. We've also had some evidence that 6 weeks is quite a large sum of money, equivalent to 6 weeks' rent for a deposit. Should that be reduced to 4 weeks?
So our evidence on the amount that tenants pay in deposits found that only 8% of renters is going to save any money if we cap deposits at 6 weeks. So we're really talking about a small minority that would benefit from the cap as it currently stands. If anything, there's a risk that when you cap something, you'll see a clustering of costs around the upper end of that cap. So you could even be increasing the average deposit as a result of capping it. So we're quite concerned about that. Our findings are that 2 out of 3 renters face financial problems as a result of the upfront costs of renting, things like having to take out a loan, borrowing money from your family and friends, or cutting back on, say, food or heating and so on. So this is a really big opportunity for the government to reduce that significant upfront cost of a deposit, but at the moment they're really missing that opportunity.
We agree that the deposits should be capped at nearer to 4 weeks. But there's also an opportunity to actually revisit and review the whole deposit system, because currently the tenant hands over £1,000 and it sits in a letting agent's account, or it goes off to one of the custodial schemes for the duration of the tenancy, when it's actually the tenant's money and could be potentially earning the tenant interest for the duration of the tenancy. So what we'd like to see is a new system where instead of handing over the money, the tenant keeps it in a particular account which is set up so that the sum of the deposit can be frozen for the duration of the tenancy. It earns interest on that. It might, part of the interest might then pay for the upkeep of the protection scheme. And then at the end of the tenancy, we could have a system where maybe they've built up a greater savings pot that could be then transferred to a new tenancy. There's an opportunity here for the government to really think, how can we make the tenants' money work for them? How can we support a savings culture among private tenants, and reduce the upfront costs of moving as well, even further.
Right, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to us this afternoon. Thank you.